Hello and well met. This is Laren with the Fantasy Grounds Academy. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about maps and the interactions with them. These are some common things that you might come across if you are using map tools in Fantasy Grounds. This assumes that you already have content, maybe you're in the middle of the game, or that you're getting ready. So what I'm going to do is take you through a couple scenarios where things can get a little dicey, no pun intended, when it comes to working with maps with Fantasy Grounds. So I'm going to start on the player side. So I have two views actually queued up here. So what I have now is actually the player side of this. I'm actually connected to myself through my local area network. So what I'm doing here is kind of emulating player. So what I see quite often is that a player will, especially if they're kind of new to virtual tabletops, there's nothing wrong with this. It's just part of the learning curve of learning how to use the platform. So what I'm going to do is actually move this token. And what you'll see quite often is a player will try to move through an opponent, which is really not allowed. I mean, the GM can obviously override that or kind of hand wave it, but generally you don't want to move through an ally or, excuse me, an enemy. You can move through an ally, but you lose 10 feet of movement. So that's a thing for this particular rule set. So if you're playing DnD5e, that's what this is referring to. It might be a little different in other rule sets, but I can't imagine you can move through somebody unless they're a spirit or something like that. And even then, there might be some kind of penalty. The other thing is how you move. So this dwarf can only move 15 feet. So if the GM approves that movement right away and you haven't finished your movement, what'll happen is you'll lose track of how many feet move. So this dwarf, in this case, can only move 25 feet. So this is where he chose to move this. So I would not approve this movement as the game master. I'd actually cancel it and ask him to redraw this or to move ahead maybe 5 feet. The other problem with this is that the DM has parked this token in the middle or the vertices of these four squares. This should actually be in a square, not in the center of four squares. It's not that big of a deal, but it does matter in distance wise and travel. So I'm going to go over to the GM side, show you what that looks like for the game master. So the game master has a lot more control over the maps. Players are kind of limited on what they can see and what they can view. So there's a green check mark that I can use to approve the movement, but already this is problematic. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the X. Is basically no, I'm not going to allow the movement because it's kind of janky and it breaks the movement. So as far as the skeleton goes, the skeleton should actually inhabit a square. There's no reason why the skeleton would be in the center. Now, if you have a large token, they do take 4 squares, so that would also be that they would be residing in the middle. But when it comes to a single square, they should reside in a square. When you're actually moving tokens, especially when you're kind of new, it helps to use the arrow keys because that actually will move it per square. Fantasy Grounds will click on the half square, so that's why you'll see a lot of tokens kind of offset because it will accept that you move a half square, but in case of distance and those sort of things and keeping track of how far you moved, it's a lot better to actually fill a square. So now that this skeleton's out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and approve this movement. I'll ask the player to move the token. So I'm going to go back and show the player side, and we'll do the movement. So as the player, I'm just like, oh, okay, sorry, I didn't know I couldn't go through an enemy like that. So I'll go ahead and move again. So what you'll see is this. And the problem with this movement is that it cuts through an actual physical barrier, and that's not going to be allowed in Fantasy Grounds because there's an occluder there. So what I'm going to do is flip back to the GM side and show you what I'm talking about. Now, this isn't totally the fault of the player. It also has to do with the map. So whoever set the map up kind of doesn't give a whole lot of indication as to what that is. However, in this case, it looks pretty much like a wall, and I don't understand why someone was trying to move through a wall other than cut corners. So what I'm going to do is flip over to the GM side, and I'll show you what that looks like. So the movement itself doesn't look too bad, except for they're trying to move through this wall. The player is less likely to notice this because they cannot see past the wall. So they're not sure what's on the other side or even what kind of occluders are on here. But I'm going to unlock the map, which it already is, and go to the line of sight tool. And what you'll see here is this line extended out here, which is going to potentially break the movement when this player is approved. So I'm going to go ahead and approve it, see what happens. So I need to be back in play mode. That's another thing, is if you're going to interact with the tokens, you have to be in play mode. That actually activates the very top layer where the tokens reside. If you're in edit mode, such as this, you can't interact with the tokens. So as a game master, you have to be in play mode. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. I'm going to hit this green check button and see, this is what you're going to get. It's going to get stuck there, and then you lose the movement that you've already taken. So if it's been more than 5 feet, that can be kind of annoying. So now I have to ask this player to move again, and they're going to say, well, what's the problem? And I say, well, you're trying to move through a wall. And they're like, well, I didn't see that. How would I know? So there are things that come up occasionally with movement. Unfortunately, the movement indicator does not take into account for the occluders, so you're going to try to move through walls occasionally, that sort of thing. And that can be kind of annoying and problematic, but there's really not a whole lot you can do other than just explain that this place is very terrain heavy. It has a lot of little nooks and crannies. So that kind of leads me to the next issue I wanted to bring up with maps is when you're actually constructing a map, or you have a map that you want to use in Fantasy Grounds, one of the faux pas that I see quite often is if I go into the this tool here for the occluders, you'll notice that most of these are pretty decent, but the problematic ones are like stuff like this. You'll have this little crack here, and it's less than I want to say it's less than 5 feet wide. So if you have little nooks and crannies in your maps that have these areas that are really tight, like right here, this is a bad spot. And the reason I say that, because when the player moves there, they might get stuck. So I'm going to see if that's the case in the situation. So I'm going to flip over to the player side and take a look at that. So I decide I'm not going to move that way. I'll move over this way as a player. And I want to go through this little passage here. So what I see already is it's going to get stuck. I didn't create that, but let's see what happens. So he wants to move through that little narrow passage. So if I flip back over to the DM side, let's take a look and see what that looks like. Okay, so yeah, so I see the movement here, but I already know as the GM that this might be problematic. We'll see. So I'm going to go ahead and prove it, but I got to make sure I'm in play mode, and then I'm going to go prove it. So this case, it actually worked. There was just enough space in it. But what will happen is you get these narrow spots that are less than 5 feet, and you're going to get people stuck, and they're going to get stacked up in that area, and it's really going to be aggravating, especially like around doors. So if you wanted to go back in this little crack here, I don't know if that's been resolved or not, but let's say he wants to. So as the player, or let's say he goes around and he wants to hide back in the spot over here. So he's looking around, the skeletons are coming. He says, well, I'm going to find a place to hide. I want to hide back in this corner behind the wall. So if you try to do something like that as a player, that may get you trapped in between the lines. So he's going to go up here. Yeah, so once he's in here, he might get trapped in here, and that might be problematic for the player. So I can't move him very easily out of these spots. You get trapped in these little areas that are like nooks and crannies. So that's something you want to try to avoid as a player. If you see something narrow like that, I would ask the GM before I moved in there if you're aware of this type of problem. What it is you don't have quite the room in here, and especially if you have more than one player token trying to access this area, it can get very crowded and messed up. So if you're the GM and you know the player is stuck, you can hold down the shift key, and that will allow you to actually click on any token on the map and move it wherever you like. If you don't do that, it's not going to allow you to go through the walls. So important thing for a game master is hold down shift, and then you can move the tokens wherever you want on the map without getting held up. So if I hold shift, I can move around anywhere. So that's helpful to move around a map if you have to place tokens in a different area, or maybe your players warp to a different side of the map, or maybe they started in one spot and then they wanted to end up in another from another session. Want to move them over really quick. You can do that, and that will, you drag each one over at one at a time into this other area. So if I hold down the shift key and we wanted to start on this other side, we could do that. So this is just a matter of learning how to use the shortcuts and some of the things that are available in Fantasy. But that's generally the biggest problem when it comes to moving maps or moving tokens on maps is one, sometimes the link between the combat tracker and the player gets broken. I don't know what exactly causes it. Quite often it's a blocking of data going from the host to the player. So it could be the host computer or the player. They might have an antivirus or some sort of firewall blocking the situation, or they don't have enough bandwidth, whatever the situation is. If it isn't that, if you're still able to access the map, you might have a black screen where it doesn't show anything but just your token. Those sort of things can sometimes be fixed by just right-clicking on a token on the map and then deleting it. So if I go to the play layer, right-click, go to delete token, and then just delete that token temporarily, and then move him right back where you had him. And that usually fixes that problem. And then you can also right-click, go to sharing, and reshare the record with your player. And as the player, you can actually close the map. And if you don't remember what map you're on, you can just double-click here on the right-hand side of your character sheet where the token is, and that will bring you back to the last map you were on. And it should clear that problem if there's no data or the images aren't being blocked or something like that. So that's a troubleshooting tip. If you're already on a map or you're going to be on a map and you can't see anything. The other thing is you have to claim your token. Sometimes when you're first put on the map hasn't refreshed. But once you click on your token, it should show the map. So if you haven't clicked on the token for the first time when you enter a new map or put on a new map, click on your token and see if that does it, or like I said, you can always close the map and reopen it. Sometimes that'll clear it. So those are just troubleshooting steps to go through. And if none of those work and you're still having issues, and you want to go to the Fantasy Grounds House of Healing on the official Fantasy Grounds website and forums, or go to their Discord channel. It's better to do the forums because you got more eyes on it. If you're going to rant and rave and complain on the other platforms such as Reddit or YouTube or Facebook, you're probably not going to get as much help. As a matter of fact, you'll probably get people fighting with you on there. So you might as well just go right to the source and get the problem solved. But this is just generally some things that happen. So if you're a game designer or someone who does maps or even, converting a module, when you're actually doing this line of sight, you don't want to be right up at the edge. So if I was doing this map here and I was going to be a developer or something, I would actually take this point and I got the selection mode. I'd actually drag this back. So that gives a little bit more room in here. And then I'd actually take this and back this off a little bit. So you can still have someone move back there and you don't get stuck as easy. So that's a tip that I learned the hard way when doing line of sight on maps. Generally what happens is they get too overcrowded. You don't have to have everything right up to the edge of the map. You just need a basic vague idea of where this stuff exists in any given situation. So like this map right here, this isn't too bad, but I might back these off just a hair so that there's more room to go through this little narrow spot. And that's something you want to try to facilitate when you're actually playing in a game. Even if the map is already done and has come with a product, whoever did the conversion or the actual line of sight work may not know this, or they may not have even played before, and they're not aware of how these images and how the map tools interacts with one another. So until you've played a few times, it's really not that apparent. So try not to put all these occluders right up to the very edge of a given boundary. So like this here, I need to close this, and then there's little parts in here that I might go back through and kind of back off so that I'm not crowding out the map too much. I mean, you got to have some of these features in here. I understand that, but you don't need every little nook and cranny. That just takes too much work, and it's way overkill for map itself. Caverns are the worst because they have all these different data points, and if you have too many of these, it actually starts adding up. and it will cause a lot of lag and performance issues. So you want to make sure you don't have 50 million of dots if not needed. If you find a map or you have gone overboard with your occluders, there is a tool called Simplify Selected Occluders. So I can double click and select all of these occluders at once, and then click on this select and simplify the selected occluders. If I click that, it takes out some of the dots. Obviously, I didn't want that to happen, but I can actually move the entire thing a little, or I can just single click and move some of these other points around a little to accommodate some of the changes that were made. But not all those tools are useful in every situation. It just depends on the map. Generally, when you have a 50,000 little dots, that's when you want to use that. So this is just a couple tips for you to help make your games a little bit smoother. I realize that not everyone's going to have the same experience and different rule sets behave differently. But when it comes to the map tools, having an area that's a little too crowded, or maybe a doorway that's less than 5 feet across, or even having your tokens moving through walls and that kind of thing when you're really not supposed to in most situations. So this character here might want to move through this wall, but they may not also know that there's an occluder there. So you kind of have to guide them. Don't get pissed off at them. Just kind of say, hey, that's a wall. You're going to have to go around or something. There's no need to get too frustrated. But if they keep doing it over and over and over, that's another situation. But teach your players how to use the map tool, how to engage with it. Don't just yell at them, because that's going to discourage them from ever wanting to play. So when you move through an area, if they move slow enough, they'll figure it out, and they'll get the hang of, they can't cut through a wall or they can't cut a corner. Because I'll see a lot, like, people will try to move through walls and stuff, and that's really just because of the way when you plot your pathway in Fantasy Grounds. If you have the map tool locked, it'll create that line and it goes through the wall. So I wish they could get rid of that line going through occluders. That would be helpful. Anyway, so that's just a quick tips there. I don't want to drag this on too long, but hopefully that helps your games a little bit and makes things a little bit smoother and kind of gives you a better idea of how the map tools work and how you engage with them. So this is the player view, and then actually this is the GM view. Yeah, so if I unlock this and go to the line of sight tool, this is what you're going to see for the line of sight that I added to the map. And as you can see, I don't go all the way out to the edges in most cases, and try to keep the areas less cluttered for room. So you want them at least 5 feet wide if you can. All right, so take care, everyone. You have a good week. It's almost Friday, hump day, so we'll see you around. And if you haven't joined our community, we are the Fantasy Grounds Academy. We are not officially part of Smiteworks, but we do have a good working relationship with them. And if you want to volunteer to show others how to use Fantasy Grounds, whether it be maps or specific rule set or conversions or even extensions, please join our community. We can use all the help we can get, and we're always looking for talent. We just have volunteers. We don't pay anyone. We don't just expect them to do anything. We try to do 1 or 2 events a month per person, but that's just a basic volunteer